It might have been the monsters under your bed, the shadows in the corner, or those creepy dementors from Harry Potter. We all had irrational fears growing up. Mine was creepy dolls. After watching a movie called Teacher's Pet, I became so terrified of dolls that my dad had my sister box hers up and store them in our basement. And I'm gonna be honest, I'm still not a huge fan of dolls, but I've mostly outgrown that fear. But along the way, though, I've picked up a few new ones like running out of money, being left without health insurance, and probably the biggest of them all, taxes. I've been saving and investing with the fear that Uncle Sam will take a huge chunk of my money. That mindset has me padding my investment accounts and inflating my FI number. But after reading Sean Mullaney and Cody Garrett's book, Tax Planning to and Through Retirement, I'm starting to rethink that, and I think you should too. To help us navigate this, I invited Sean and Cody to walk us through their strategies for optimizing taxes before and during early retirement. We'll cover things such as which accounts to deplete first, how to control your taxable income through strategic selling, ways to minimize sequence of return risk, and even how to pay almost nothing in taxes some years without cutting expenses. If you want practical strategies for optimizing taxes on your path to early retirement, this episode's for you. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Mr. Measure Twice and the FI tax guy, Cody Garrett and Sean Mullaney. Sean, how about you kick us off here? Can you paint a scenario where an early retiree could fund their lifestyle while paying little, maybe even zero taxes?
So think about the first year, 2, 3 of retirement, and especially an early retirement. So say a married couple, they're both in their late 50s, and they retire, and they're going to live off just $100,000 to start for the first full year. Well, okay, they got to pay for that. And aren't they going to pay some taxes? Well, maybe not. What they could do is they could sell $100,000 worth of mutual funds, ETFs, whatever it might be, in a taxable brokerage account. And you say, well, wait a minute, that's going to trip capital gain income. And you're correct. But there are two reasons that $100,000 of living expense funded by selling, say, mutual funds may not trigger any federal income tax, and in fact is likely not to trigger any federal income tax. The first thing is basis recovery. So when we sell $100,000 of pick your favorite mutual fund, ABC mutual fund, you sell that, well, what's your taxable income, your capital gain on that sale? It's not $100,000. It's $100,000 less your basis. You have some historic cost, some historic investment in that holding that you sold. So maybe your basis is $30,000 or $40,000 or $50,000. Subtract that basis from the proceeds from that $100,000 to get your taxable gain in that situation. So that's the first reason you might pay zero federal income tax. The second one is a great feature of federal income tax law, the 0% long-term capital gains bracket. Think about an early retiree. He or she has probably been investing in taxable brokerage accounts, in most cases, certainly not all, but in most cases for 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. Those holdings are so-called long-term holdings. And if that married couple can keep their taxable income below the top of the 0% long-term capital gains bracket, year 2025, that's $96,700. Right? If they keep their income below that, including the gain, guess what? That gain goes out at a 0% rate. So when we think about basis recovery, the 0% long-term capital gains rate, and oh, by the way, the high standard deduction, which we will probably come back to later, there are plenty of ways an affluent retired couple at the beginning of their retirement could live off taxable brokerage accounts and have 1, 2, 3, 5, or even more years of zero federal income tax, even though they're living off six figures.
Yeah, it's so good. Honestly, you changed my opinion on so many things. I was talking to Cody before you hopped on that I have pretty much shifted everything to taxable or traditional accounts in recent years because I'm in kind of my peak earning years right now. And this is another one that you have me changing my opinion on. I can see myself with many of years where I'm probably putting up zero to maybe a little bit of taxable income and paying taxes out.
A big concept here that we haven't thought about too much, even before writing the book, I'm like, I didn't have this framework that when you're in your working years, your gross income is going to be higher than your spending. So think about, if you're paid $200,000 at work, they take out federal, state, local, right? You have maybe FICA tax, Medicare, Social Security, right? And you might, save, invest, or spend what's left. In your retirement years, your gross income is typically going to be lower than your spending. So just like in Sean's example, you could be spending $100,000 in retirement, but there's a really good chance that your gross income is not going to be equal to or exceeding that number. So I think just understanding this framework that while you're working, Sean mentions it in the book, it's a really great point, that when you're working, you really can't control your income based on your spending. But in retirement, your spending effectively is a brake on that income. So yeah, in most cases, early retirees, maybe we'll get into more numbers later, but it's very rare for an early retiree, even maintaining their desired lifestyle, to really have an effective average tax rate over 10%. It's very rare to get over that number based on my experience helping early retirees.
Yeah, because you're making the point here that I'm not going to say no to my employer paying me $150,000 if I'm only spending $50,000 in my current life right now. I'm just got to take the arbitrage, go invest it, do all the other things. Where I'm an early retiree and not working anymore, but I only need $50,000. I'm probably only pulling out $50,000 from my investment accounts that year.
That's right.
And on top of that, not just we're putting aside some money for employment taxes that we're not going to have to set aside for an early retirement. We're also, in the FI community, very heavy savers too. Some of us saving up to 50% of our income, which we'll no longer have to do after we reached financial independence. So maybe I needed $150,000 to pay my employment taxes, to meet my financial goals for investing and saving. Both of those two big buckets go away, and I'm kind of left with like what I actually spend from just a day-to-day living at that point in time.
That's right, Justin. We have this sort of inchoate fear of taxes are going to be bad in retirement. But we have to start with that fundamental point you just made. Your spending is almost certainly going down, not because, you're an old fuddy-duddy, but because, like you're saying, you don't have to fund your retirement anymore. You don't have to fund payroll taxes, which are a huge expense for most folks. And, we all here are self-employed to varying degrees. So we know that because we're not only paying income tax, we're paying FICA tax. Or self-employment tax, FICA tax. It's a little daunting. So I think it's sort of time to think about, when are you going to pay the most tax? And isn't that the time to prioritize reducing that tax? And Cody and I, we've done analysis over analysis, whether it's working with our clients, whether it's in our book. We find, look, the odds are for most Americans, and especially most in the FI community, the odds are you're going to pay the most tax during your accumulation years. So isn't that the time? Why not reduce taxes when it's most burdensome? And then we can figure it out during retirement. There's still plenty of planning we can do in early retirement and even late retirement. But we've had this sort of inchoate fear of taxes in retirement, but few commentators raise this issue of, wait a minute, taxes during our working years can bite pretty hard.
Well said, Sean. Old fuddy-duddy. I like that. I need to use that on some things. I don't know if I would mind being called that. Let's jump into it. So we're going to be talking about kind of strategies for leading up to and really kind of post early retirement. And you guys do a good job breaking down the stages and kind of ages in your book. I'm really got to be looking at the stages from early retirement to 65, because some interesting things kind of happen after 65, sometimes good, sometimes bad. Up through 65, though, you guys recommend that drawing down on your taxable brokerage account first is more than likely the most optimal strategy. What about that account makes that true?
So I'll give you a few reasons. One, we're going to come back to, which is so-called sequence of return risk. Two is optimization for what's called the premium tax credit. So most early retirees, not all, by the way, but most, will be on an ACA medical insurance plan. And so what that does is it says, okay, you're going to have a rather hefty premium, at least to start. But we're going to look at your income level. And if your income level is relatively modest, you're going to get a substantial, what they call premium tax credit against that subsidy. So the early part of retirement is a really good time to show very low income. One, because we like to save federal and state income tax. Nobody likes paying those. But two, it's also a good time because we want to, generally speaking, lower our income so we get a higher premium tax credit. And then three, another factor that some folks don't consider is a lot of early retirees are going to have these taxable brokerage accounts. And while we do live in a low yield world, which means they pay very low dividends if they're in equities, generally speaking, You got to look at your own portfolio, but in a very general sense, absolutely, we live in a low yield world, which is advantageous to us. But one thing we found is by spending down the taxable accounts first, you tend to lower the taxes on the dividends that are spit out. So that's a feature, not a bug of spending down these taxable brokerage accounts first. And then I'll mention a fourth issue, which is a relatively modest issue, but it's still an issue, is creditor protection. Our retirement accounts, IRAs, 401ks, Roths, those things tend to enjoy some degree of creditor protection. Our taxable brokerage accounts tend not to enjoy any degree of creditor protection. So that means if you get into a car accident, somebody sues you. So why not spend down the taxable accounts first while you're just leaving those retirement accounts in retirement accounts so they sort of build up and you're becoming more creditor protected? Now, most folks in the audience should at least be thinking about this concept of personal liability umbrella insurance, but it's also good to belt and suspenders it. Why not have an umbrella policy for some amount and have money in retirement accounts? So those are the main reasons I like conceptually when we first retire, if we can, spend down the taxable accounts first.
Cody, any thoughts to add on that?
Yeah, so we often think about tax payments in early retirement, but keep in mind that both tax payments and those health insurance premiums through the ACA plans, those are based on income, not on assets. So I think a lot of people who are retiring early, they're saying, I'm retiring with over $1 million in investments. There's no way I can get subsidized healthcare. Like, I have way too much on my balance sheet. But the IRS doesn't look at your balance sheet. They look at your cash flow statement. So I think it's really important here that in early retirement, that's at pre-65, especially if you're focused on those premium tax credits. In 2026, that 400% of the federal poverty level cliff comes back. And there's a lot of fear right now of, oh no, I'm not going to get any subsidies. But just keep in mind that as long as you have control and intentionality around like where you draw from, the best way to keep income low as a starting point, like Sean mentioned, is really starting with your checking, savings, taxable brokerage accounts, where you might be able to actually provide all the expenses for your desired lifestyle with very little income, including very little ordinary income. And then once you've maintained your desired lifestyle with your expenses, then you can say, hey, where do I sit tax-wise? And what opportunities now do I have to potentially look at Roth conversions, the tax gain harvesting, some of these other tactics that we mentioned in the book.
Fair. Yeah, we're going to park premium tax credit for a second because I think that's probably a whole thread on itself. But to circle back on really the reasoning behind taxable brokerage accounts outside of the creditor protection, Sean, I love this idea around getting rid of the accounts that are spitting off some of the income that you're going to have to pay for anyway. And it's not uncommon that people in our community have $500,000 taxable brokerage accounts that, even if they're in low cost index funds and it might be spitting off 1 or 2% in dividends, like you might be looking at $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 of income that you got to think about and tax plan on every single year. While your retirement accounts, if they're spitting off dividends, you're not paying for those. So you might as well let those sit there for a second and really go attack the taxable account first and start drawing down on that so that every year that taxable income that's coming out of the dividends is less and less substantial. And then you can do some more strategic planning later down in life.
That's a great point, Justin. We found that if you want to tax those dividends, a great way to do it is spend IRA money first. What tends to happen because of this basis recovery, because of the 0% long-term capital gains bracket, they're going to be very affluent, seven figures, well into seven-figure retirees who can get to an early retirement and pay zero federal income tax on those dividends if they're spending down the taxable brokerage accounts first. So I think that is a very powerful driver. The other thing I'm going to mention is uncertainty in the future. And I know in your audience, Justin, there are not that many folks that remember the early to mid 1980s. I myself only remember sort of the mid 1980s. Back then, interest rates and dividend yields were much higher. I think something like the S&P 500, one of the broad domestic equity indexes, was over 5% in dividend yield. Today, it's going to be under 2%. In theory, look, we're doing retirement planning for the rest of our lives. Well, there might be some listeners out there who are going to retire in 7 or 8 years. Well, all right, what's going to be the dividend yield in 10 years? We don't fully know the answer to that question. And you just never know. Maybe it's going to 3, 4, 5, 6%. And so by spending down the taxable account first, you mitigate that risk 5 years down the road okay, now I'm going to pay more taxes because these dividend yields or interest rates or whatever it might be went up.
That's a good thought. Cody, how about you?
Yeah, so there's also this concept of asset location. So we've been talking about stocks and dividends, right? Those have those favorable tax rates for qualified dividends, the long-term capital gains. But you wonder where should I keep my bonds, right? I think that most retirees, including early retirees, they're going to have some fixed income, some bonds in their portfolio, thinking about sequence of returns risk and just thinking, hey, I need some stability and liquidity in my portfolio, not just all growth long-term. So we also discuss in the book this concept of asset location of, hey, if you're going to keep bonds in your total portfolio, that doesn't mean you have to keep, let's say you have a 70-30 portfolio of 70% stock, 30% bonds. That doesn't mean your taxable brokerage, your traditional IRA and Roth IRA have to be perfectly mirrored 70-30. The numbers aren't in my head right now, but you can say, hey, maybe I go 100% stock with those favorable dividends in my taxable brokerage, and then I keep my taxable bonds that are paying off the interest income in my traditional IRA, and then maybe the Roth IRA is also stock heavy. So again, you can use this tactic that we discussed as asset location to really put the right assets in the right place. Again, tax optimization, certainly, diversification and the ability to meet your desired lifestyle is prioritized above that. But it's certainly worth looking, especially in the FI community. We're always looking for what's a way I can kind of tighten the screw on my retirement plan. So asset location is one of those cool tactics that we like to explore.
Let's go deeper into that, Cody. We talked kind of about the account to draw down first. Are there specific assets that you should also be draw down on first? I know you guys borrowed the concept cats and dogs from J.L. Collins in the book as well. Curious to know, what are some things in my portfolio I should be considering selling first?
Sure. So as I mentioned, that diversification, right, is more important than tax optimization. That if you have that cat and dog, or let's say, 90% of your portfolio is a single company, right, stock, you're probably going to be prioritizing unwinding that security for diversification purposes, really not letting the tax tail wag the dog, as you might have heard. Beyond the cats and dogs, you might be wondering, well, Cody just told us to keep your bonds that are generally considered more stable than stocks. Why would we keep those in the accounts we're not taking money out of? And why would we invest in the more volatile, aggressive stocks in the accounts we're taking money from? And again, I know that asset location, this concept of asset location, is very difficult to understand conceptually of why am I taking money out of this account that's the most volatile with my stocks, and I'm keeping my stable money in accounts I'm not going to touch for years. You have to step back and consider your total portfolio as being fungible. If I'm 70-30 across all my accounts versus 100% stock and maybe 40-60 in my traditional IRA, if I step back and look at the total portfolio, you can have the same asset allocation across the board, but you just have to really truly have to understand the concept before you can get, I always say clarity precedes confidence. So you have to have clarity on how the strategy and tactic works before you can gain that confidence to say, I feel comfortable selling my stocks and living off of those proceeds. But thankfully, as Sean mentioned, the long-term capital gains tax treatment on selling those long-term appreciated securities, those favorable tax rates on the long-term capital gains, and also that basis recovery of selling $100,000 worth of stock, you're not going to be taxed on $100,000, just the gain itself. There's a lot of great tax play, but really you have to step back and understand the whole strategy before you start implementing.
And Sean, I'm also guessing that if I'm selling a bunch of stock and my taxable to fund my lifestyle and all my bonds are parked in my retirement accounts, I could be doing some balancing throughout the selling of those, and then maybe buying, selling some bonds and rebuying some stocks too to keep my portfolio. It's not like I'm just got to draw down on all of my stocks first and then I'm just left with bonds.
That's exactly right, Justin. So you can live theoretically on stock sales in your taxable account, but then a lot of early retirees are going to have some combination of traditional retirement accounts and Roth retirement accounts. Okay. So separate and apart from that, you can go into those retirement accounts and rejigger. And you say, oh, I sold a bunch of stocks, so my bond allocation is now way higher. Okay, maybe you sell some of those bonds in a 401k or an IRA, no problem, and then reallocate back to the stock position. Who knows too, market performance happens while we're drawing down too. So it could be that your stocks are still up because, you did withdrawals, you sold some stocks, but the market performance was such that your stocks actually went up as a proportion of your portfolio.
Yeah.
So you might want to separately go into the 401k and sell some of the stocks in the 401k or the IRA and buy some more bonds to rebalance to get to the desired portfolio allocation. We wrote a book that's over 300 pages. It's not an investment allocation book, but what it does is this concept that Cody talks about, asset location. What we're telling folks is, regardless of your desired asset or allocation, you can use the taxable accounts and the traditional accounts and the Roth accounts to achieve some efficiencies, particularly in the early retirement phase, through this asset location concept. And then you do you in terms of your desired asset allocation.
That makes sense. Cody, I actually learned from you earlier this year too that you can sell specific lots. I think you were talking about within inside of Fidelity, and I watched a video, and we can link that video in the show notes to show specifically in Fidelity how you can do that. But I'm guessing across a lot of different brokerage platforms you can do this. Can you talk about or give us kind of a brief understanding of this and how someone might use this tactic optimally?
Sure. So every time you buy a security, let's say you're buying ABC stock, let's say I log in today, I buy some ABC stock. That's going to be considered a lot. So a lot is like that. Each time you purchase, you're creating a new lot that has a specific date and time you bought it, right? A big part of that is certainly understanding when you end up selling it, those holding periods of whether it was short term, which is held a year or less, or long term, more than a year. Again, long term, those taxable brokerage that provides that favorable tax treatment that we love, including potentially 0%. Each time you buy something, you create a new lot. And also, not just when you buy something intentionally, like logging in, but let's say you receive dividends and let's say they're automatically reinvested, which is a pretty smart decision generally, especially for those on the path to retirement. Every time you're paid a dividend that's reinvested, you buy a new lot. You buy a new kind of package. It's kind of like going to Amazon and you put it in my cart. So you get a new cart of securities every time you buy, whether intentionally or with those dividends being reinvested. And when you end up selling, a lot of people just go through the basic form and they say sell this many shares of this security, and they just press sell. It's really a really good thing is whether it's Schwab, Fidelity, Vanguard, they have these what are called cost basis disposal methods, where you can say, hey, I want to sell first in, first out. So I'm going to sell the security that I bought first, right? Which would probably give you a long-term holding period, but it might actually end up being a significant percentage gain. First in, first out, you might end up selling the first thing. There might be last in, first out. So I'm going to sell what I bought recently, which might not have a big gain, but it also might have a short-term holding period, which is not favorable. So I like to go in, most of these, Fidelity, Vanguard, Schwab, et cetera, they allowed you to sell what's called infractional shares, where you can sell specific dollar amounts, not just shares. But also there's something called specific identification, spec ID. And you might, if you don't see that, by the way, you might just go into, whenever you go into the sell part of your custodian, it might say identify lots. So rather than just putting in the amount of shares, there might be a little link that says specify lots. So if you click specify lots, you can actually look through all your lots. You can also export to Excel if you want to go real deep. But for example, here's a really cool example. So we just installed a new AC unit in our house and got all of our ductwork redone for $22,000. And we don't like to keep $22,000 just sitting in our checking account, bank account. So I actually had to sell $22,000 worth of stock. Thankfully appreciated, but I sold $20,000 worth of stock. And I could have sold, if I just sold just generally, it might have sold the stock that I bought years ago. That might have been up 50% since when I bought them. But no, I was actually able to specify the lots that I actually bought just a month ago that had barely appreciated. So rather than selling $22,000 worth and having to pay tax on $10,000 worth of gain, I sold $22,000 worth and only had a $150 gain, right? And it's going to be taxed. This case was actually selling something short term, but again, I'd much rather pay have a income of $150 short term than $10,000 long term. That's going to be taxed at 15%. So again, assuming you have the fundamental understanding of how this works, specific identification gives you that extra level of command over what you sell and when.
I love that you can control or be really specific on some of this stuff, so that we're talking about these bands a lot, and you guys talk about it in your book a lot too, the premium tax credit band, or even some of the effective or the marginal rates whenever you jump up a different class here. There might be a year where you're like, I have plenty of runway and I can go ahead and sell one of my older ones and assume more cap gains there. Or there might be a year where you're like, man, business was pretty good, but I need some money because I'm doing the duct work and it cost me $20,000. I'm going to sell something a little bit more recent and not have to necessarily realize as much capital gains if I were doing the first in, first out approach on this. Let's talk about sequence of return risk. And Sean, you mentioned this. It's something that we all worry about. And essentially it's I start my early retirement journey, and the next 3, 5, 10 years are bad years for the stock market. And in my assumptions, I was assuming it was going to grow 5% every single year. But I've had a couple of negative years, and all of a sudden now I'm looking at my accounts, drawn down on my accounts, and they're going down faster than I thought they were going to go down. What about the taxable brokerage account kind of helps alleviate some of the sequence of return risk?
So Justin, sequence of return risk is amplified by expenses in early retirement. In theory, if you got to early retirement and you spent zero, at least for that time frame, you have basically no sequence of return risk. You're not selling into a down market. That's essentially what sequence of return risk is, very oversimplified, is we're going to sell into a down market early in our retirement. We sell into a down market in our 90s, tends not to have that much deleterious effect on our financial success because it's so late in our time frame. So one way to reduce or mitigate our sequence of return risk is to reduce expenses in the first part of our retirement. And that's what, generally speaking, living off capital gain income does in the first part of retirement. We've illustrated that it is very possible for affluent, very successful early retirees to live off capital gains and pay zero or close to zero in federal income tax in the first part of their retirement. That's a really good time to have very low federal income tax. It's a good time to be reducing an expense. That's all income tax is. It's an expense just like the mortgage check, or at least the interest on the mortgage check. It's an expense just like the grocery store. So why not, in the first part of our retirement, reduce that risk, thus reduce to some degree the sequence of return risk?
I think that makes sense. So let's assume that over the course of my whole life, I'm probably got to be paying 10% taxes. And that might cost me $10,000 a year in taxes I'd have to set aside. Sequence of return risk, why not reduce my expense load early on, that those first couple of years, take the 0% taxes early on by being very strategic about my taxable brokerage accounts, and then go pay the 15 or 20% taxes later on in life, even if that time really comes, although I'm sure you guys would argue that. But what you're suggesting with this approach is that you can minimize an expense, a big expense, which is taxes, by being very strategic with drawing down on the taxable account first.
Yeah, and there's this beautiful irony that when stocks go down, the silver lining is, yes, you're selling stocks that have gone down, which feels scary, but guess what? The amount of capital gains percentage on that is going down because they've gone down in value. And you can still run over to the traditional IRA, the Roth IRA, and potentially rebalance those accounts without tax consequences to get you back to your ideal asset allocation. So there's kind of that, again, the beautiful irony or the silver lining of stocks going down. And when you've been intentional about asset location, like there's a really good tax play there.
And Justin, one other point I'm going to make is the favored approach that Cody and I generally advocate for most Americans is counter to a lot of commentators. A lot of commentators really love Roth conversions in early retirement. And we're not necessarily against them, but we're for being very strategic and very measured and relatively conservative in the first part of our early retirement when it comes to Roth conversions, especially when you compare us to other commentators out there. And I think there are two drivers of that. One is this sequence of return risk issue. By doing large Roth conversions earlier in retirement, you're amping up sequence of return risk. That is what it is. We can debate that all day. The second thing we're looking at is the far end of retirement. And we have sort of two arguments in that regard. First one is taxes, even for the very, very, very successful who mostly relied on traditional retirement accounts, tend not to be as bad as a lot of people fear in the far end of retirement. So that's one argument we make. The second is, even if we're wrong on the first argument, the far end of retirement is a great time. If we could only pick one time in our financial life to have a lot of taxes, we'd pick the far end, the 80s and the 90s, where you say, oh my goodness, you're old and vulnerable. Well, wait a minute. If you're having a lot of taxes in the far end of retirement, it means you're very financially successful. We ran through a lot of numbers in the book, and we just find that, okay, if you're going to have tax inefficiencies in your 80s and beyond, it's almost certainly because you were very financially successful. But let's just say there is tax risk. isn't that a great time to park tax risk? In our 30s, we may have kids we got to support, a spouse we got to support. In our 50s and 60s and early retirement, well, wait a minute, we're at the beginning of this thing. We don't know how this is ultimately going to work. But in our 80s and 90s, we're already financially successful. Even if we have tax inefficiencies, they can't derail us at that point. We're too successful. And, oh, by the way, what are we going to be doing in our 80s and 90s? We're going to be, hiking Mount Everest. And no, we're not. Our expenses are naturally going to come down anyway, so we're not even going to need the money as much. So look, there's no perfect tax planning strategy, but I think a favorable attribute of our favorite approach is that to the extent we're moving tax risk within a lifetime, we're generally speaking, although we certainly offer mitigation tactics for the late part of life, we're generally speaking moving it to the later part of life where it has less impact on overall financial success. And that's something, people offer tax commentary, but sometimes it's not married with, well, wait a minute, how does this work with our overall financial plan?
Yeah, that's good points. What about you, Cody?
Yeah, so I'll add to that. A lot of the commentary too is this idea of, I don't want my kids to inherit my taxes. I don't want my kids to end up inheriting a $2 million IRA with these. They have to unwind it all within 10 years. That's a ton of taxes they're paying. First off, again, the general idea of having a retirement account is to meet the sufficiency of the retiree. It's designed for deferral and paying taxes on that income for the original owner. Thankfully, actually having the 10-year for the beneficiary is actually a nice benefit that we've been given that they don't have to give us. And also, typically the retiree who's worried about their kids paying taxes on the future inheritance, that simply means they're underspending and undergiving during their own lifetime. I'm all for legacy planning. I'm all for, hey, I want to make sure that my kids and grandkids, I want to give them a nice gift upon death. But that also makes us step back and say, hey, is it possible to start giving, right, spending and giving and really investing in experiences while I'm here with them, right, rather than just leaving behind a lot of money? A lot of parents, a lot of financial planning clients I've worked with who inherit money from their parents, the number one thing they said was, wow, I just inherited $2 million from my mom who passed away. I really wish that she could have enjoyed this money and we could have experienced life together using this money. So I think, this definitely goes beyond the taxes, but I think it's worth considering if you're really worried about this potential tax bomb in retirement. Maybe that means that you can lean into spending and giving more while you're here. And I think a lot of kids listening, he'll say, hey, I'd much rather enhance our experiences as a family. Maybe an Airbnb that's right on the beach rather than a few blocks from the beach. Or maybe we fly first class instead of business class on our trip to Japan. Or maybe, as a parent, maybe I'm going to pay for all of our kids and all their spouses to go on the trip with us because I'd much rather spend that time with them. And it's kind of ironic that the more you spend and give during life, the less worry you have about taxes moving forward.
That's a good point. And yeah, as somebody that is in his early 30s and kind of starting to go through this with his parents as well, I'm always telling my dad, Dad, don't think about me and Kyle and Ashley post life. I would rather go on awesome vacations with you every single year and rather than inherit any size of income. And hopefully at that moment, whenever my parents do pass away, I'm in a position financially that money doesn't matter too much for me anymore. I really appreciate my parents' support and help through my late teens and early 20s. I don't need my parents' support as much anymore now into my 30s, definitely probably not in my 40s and 50s. So I would rather him go and spend it, not even on me, but just on sheer enjoyment on whatever he wants to do or for giving, than really be thinking about the legacy or the passing on of an inheritance.
Yeah, and last thing on that, the best gift that you can give your children is your own financial security. We talk about tax optimization, Roth conversions. They might not make or break a retirement plan, but it will give you that extra level of security and comfort so that, again, nobody wants to be a burden financially on their kids. This book is not about necessarily all the different drawdown strategies and the 4% rule and going in that direction. But I think it's really going to help you gain clarity and confidence on how to kind of pad your own security so that your kids, if they inherit money, it's a blessing and not a burden.
I mentioned we'd come back to the premium tax credit. Sean, maybe you can start on this one here. Some definite, you kind of briefly explained premium tax credit. There's this weird band that you kind of have to play in to get this. And I'm pretty sure it's a cliff too. So $1 over, you lose all of it. If we could take a step back, kind of explain premium tax credit again, and then just talk about this band. I'm going to want to be talking about a little bit of how to draw out of accounts to make sure we kind of fit into that band.
When we think about the premium tax credit, essentially what happened was 15 years ago, it's a long time ago now for some listeners, a political decision was made in the country that has never been overturned. and it was basically this. For some Americans, we are going to run your insurance, your medical insurance expense through the Internal Revenue Code. So the premium tax credit is not a tax, but it behaves like a tax. So that's why tax planning can be very beneficial in this regard. So let's think about this. What they said was, okay, for the very poor Americans, Medicaid is the answer. But for the very affluent Americans, generally speaking, we don't want to give any subsidy on that insurance expense. And then I'm going to use broad parameters. You really have to look at your state rules too in this regard. Essentially from about 100% of the federal poverty level every year in terms of income, not in terms of assets, income, from about 100 to 138, 150% of federal poverty level of income to about 400% of federal poverty level of income, we're going to give a subsidy for that expense. And in the year 2026, if we use 2025 numbers, which that's what we do, I believe for a family of two, 400% of federal poverty level is income of $84,600. And these numbers change every year. They, are inflation adjusted. So what that means is for most listeners, if you're going to be on an ACA medical insurance plan in 2026, your ability to claim a premium tax credit, if your income is high enough to be at least about 100% or 138% of federal poverty level, up to that 400%, and it varies household size. So for our two-person household, it's $84,600. Once you go over that, though, you entirely lose the premium tax credit in the year 2026. And within those bands, it's like a sliding scale. That's this wonky scale. Yeah, you generally have to look at an IRS publication or at least do some internet research to figure out where you are in the scale. And so the lower the income within that scale, the higher the premium tax credit. So controlling for income is very favorable when we're on an ACA medical insurance plan. And one of the first ways we do that is through taxable brokerage accounts. And maybe we're using specific identification like Cody was talking about. Maybe we don't reinvest our dividends. So, if we're going to get a 1% or 2% dividend this year, maybe we take that into our checking account. Why would we do that? So that we'd avoid another capital gain transaction. And for most, not all, but most even affluent retirees, we're probably going to be able to keep our income below that 400% of federal poverty level. There's some other tactics we could deploy starting in 2026. We can sign up for a bronze plan, which gives us the automatic ability in 2026 and beyond to make a deductible HSA contribution. That's a way to control income for this purpose. So, and by the way, that not only does that control income, it gives us a tax-free pot that we could then go to if we have a big medical expense, so we don't have to trip another capital gain or take an IRA distribution. So there are things out there where essentially just in the big picture is for most, income control and trying to keep our income relatively modest is going to be the play in early retirement to increase the credit and thus lower our medical insurance expense.
Yeah, and I'll add quickly that a lot of people say, well, once I'm retired, I can't contribute to an HSA. And that's not true. So an HSA, a health savings account, has no earned income requirement. That is for the IRA, the individual retirement account. So just keep in mind, even if you're fully retired, you're only taking money out of your accounts, as long as you're covered by the high deductible health plan. In 2026, that's all bronze ACA plans, which is great. Because also keep in mind that some states don't even have HSA eligible plans right now. They will next year, hopefully, right? Because assuming they're a bronze plan, but the bronze plans are typically cheaper, so less premiums. But also, even without earned income, you can contribute to an HSA, and those are pretty significant. And again, as Sean mentioned, the HSA contributions, they're going to show up on your tax return on Form 8889, and that's actually an adjustment to income. That's actually reducing your household income. So it's kind of ironic, like joining a bronze plan in 2026, contributing to an HSA, that could actually keep that income low and within those phase outs that Sean mentioned.
Very generally speaking, we're probably looking at a band of like 20,000 to 80,000 of taxable income. This is not how much is on your own, like how much assets you own. This isn't even how much assets you sell, but really the difference of how much you sell versus the basis of that is kind of what the band we're looking at, minus any other money that you make on the side too.
Justin, for most Americans, if it's a two-person household, it's between 21,000 and change, might be a little more than that, and then 84,600 for next year. And it's generally speaking, adjusted gross income. There could be, I believe there's one adjustment there. They call it modified adjusted gross income, but for most, it's just going to be your adjusted gross income. So if we're going to get really technical, it's not taxable income, it's adjusted gross income. And we talk about this in the book. There are other resources online about it. It's a little dense and it's a little complicated, but we have a whole chapter in the book about it. And it might be the sort of chapter that some might have to read 2 or 3 times just because it does get a little dense, but it is absolutely something folks can plan around. I will say this too. Cody and I are both financial planners and advisors. And this is something that most planners have not gotten a lot of education around. So we're hoping to sort of spread some awareness through this book in the advisor community and in the DIY community. And one thing we both tend to say is an informed client gets the most out of working with an advisor. So even for those in the audience who are like, oh, well, I have a financial planner, well, maybe you should look at resources such as our book so that you can get more out of working with that planner, especially on a more complicated subject like the premium tax credit.
It actually kind of reminds me of those commercials where you see a commercial for a medicine that says, ask your doctor about this. So our book is kind of like, ask your planner about this tactic.
And Cody, I just want to make sure I get this right too. It's a cliff. If it's 84,000, let's just not call it change right now. 84,000 is the cutoff, and we make $84,001 in adjusted gross income. We lose the entirety of that premium tax credit.
With a caveat that it's a phase out. It's not an all or nothing. So like you said, like if you're at the very bottom, if you're at the 138% federal poverty level, you're getting a really nice, you're probably paying zero, potentially for your health plan. But like the difference between like 400 and if you go $1 over, it's not really like, yes, it's a cliff, but it's not like you are getting, maximized premium tax credits and suddenly you're getting none. So it is a phase out, but yes, it is a cliff starting in 2026 again.
Cool. And then there might just be, if you're nearing that cliff, there might just be a couple of strategic plays like investing in an HSA, like selling a more recent lot that won't trip as much capital gains, or doing a few other very interesting tax planning things, especially if the ductwork comes up and you need $20,000 to pay the contractor and you don't want to trip too much cap gains and then lose the eligibility for the premium tax credit.
Yeah, and something that a lot of commentators would say we're crazy about is, hey, if there's a lumpy expense in early retirement in those years that you're trying to get premium tax credits, like for example, the AC going out, spending $22,000, I also could have taken that $22,000 out of my Roth IRA. And people say, don't take money out of your Roth IRA. That's the best account for long-term growth. But again, Roth IRAs aren't, like the whole purpose of a Roth IRA isn't to just grow tax-free and then die with it, right? It's really, you can be strategic with both the Roth IRA and what Sean calls PUCME, which is previously unreimbursed qualified medical expenses from an HSA, that you can take money out of an HSA and a Roth IRA, especially in those years where you had that like real lumpy expense, whether it's an emergency like AC going out, or like, hey, we're gonna go on a Viking cruise that costs $50,000, and we don't want to increase our income to a level where we miss out on premium tax credits and bump ourselves up into higher tax brackets.
Yeah, and I'll just add that both in the financial planner community and in the financial independence community, there's this hesitance to ever take out from a Roth IRA, and certainly before we turn 59 and a half, oh my goodness, why would you take out from a Roth IRA? And I'm not saying to willy-nilly do it, but if we are subject to both federal and state income tax and the premium tax credit prior to Medicare enrollment, which generally is the first of the month you turn 65, for many in the audience, they're going to be subject to 2 levels of tax effectively, income taxes and the premium tax credit in those years. So isn't it at least worth considering strategic tactical Roth IRA distributions in those years when it can avoid not 1 but 2 levels of tax? It could be great later in life too, but later in life it only avoids 1 level of tax, the federal and state income tax. So I do think part of what we're trying to do with this book is get some thinking going on. And I think among planners, among DIYers, among financial independence folks, it's time to start thinking a little bit more seriously about when could a Roth IRA distribution help me the most? And maybe for some in the audience, that's going to be when it can both help optimize for premium tax credit and lower federal income tax.
Yeah, just a quick reminder that when you take money out of a Roth IRA before age 59 and a half, thankfully, the withdrawal order, you actually take out your own contributions first before taking out conversion amounts and earnings. So that means let's say that over your working career, you've contributed $50,000 to a Roth IRA. You can take that $50,000 back out at any age for any reason, no tax, no penalty. And also with a credit, keep in mind, we've been calling this a premium tax credit. A credit is not the same thing as a deduction. So a credit, I say that a deduction is like a tax coupon, and a tax credit is like a gift card. So a tax credit reduces your tax liability dollar for dollar. Talking about numbers, but I'm talking about, premium tax credit could potentially, like, for example, a family of 4 retiring early. I'm looking at even, again, it's income based, not asset based. I've helped people who have, 1 to 2 million in investments reduce their premiums by over $20,000 a year. So, the cost of health insurance, yes, it can get expensive, but also, again, the more expensive health insurance costs, like the more beneficial these tactics become. And I would say for a single early retiree, they might be saving up to maybe $6,000 a year in healthcare cost. But, families with multiple kids, you're looking at $20,000+ a year and potential credits, which again is reducing your tax liability. And as you mentioned, Sean, like the premium tax credit, it's more of a discount on your health insurance, not really like it's in the tax realm. But I think a lot of times when we think about premium tax credits, we think that reducing your premium tax credit is like being taxed more. It's just really saying you're getting less of a discount on your health insurance.
That makes sense. Tax planning to and through early retirement, guys. I'm so excited for this to get launched next week and in the hands of everybody. At this point in time, when you're listening to it, you can go out and you can purchase the book. As someone that's been starting to read the book, it's one of those deals where you're going to probably flip open to one chapter and reread one chapter throughout all of your years of early retirement as different situations or scenarios come open. This doesn't seem like a book where you pick it up once, you read it front to back, and then you put it down and you never pick it up again. Thank you so much for creating this awesome resource, especially for the early retirees. This is really exciting. I'm glad you guys did it.
Thanks so much, Justin, for your kind words. Yeah, we're hoping to get the ideas out into the world. And yeah, it's available Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all sorts of places online.
Yeah, I appreciate you so much. I also say that if you kind of want to figure out where to go first, we actually have a landing page, measuretwicemoney.com/book. And that'll give you the links for both the paperback and the Kindle ebook, depending on how you like to read.
That's awesome. Once again, this is Sean Mullaney and Cody Garrett, two of the awesome tax guys in our space here in the FI community. Guys, thanks so much for coming on the show and sharing so much knowledge.
Thanks so much for having us. Really enjoyed the conversation.
It was so awesome having both Cody and Sean on the podcast. I love getting two experts for the price of one, and these guys are it. Both of them have been doing some incredible work bringing tax education to the FI community. I came away with pages of notes from their book and this interview, and honestly, I'm feeling a lot less worried about taxes in early retirement. I'm actually feeling a little excited to put some of these strategies into practice. One of my big takeaways was taxable brokerage accounts. While I still love my retirement accounts, I've grown more and more fond of taxable brokerage accounts as I start talking to some of the people that are using them in their early retirement journeys. Especially after hearing Sean's scenario at the start of this episode, I realized I may be able to fund my early FI lifestyle with withdrawals from my taxable account while paying little, maybe even no taxes some years. Health insurance has also been a big concern of mine, but learning how the premium tax credits work and honestly figuring out how I can manage my adjusted gross income so I can qualify for the premium tax credits every single year has given me a lot of relief as well. At the end of the day, taxes aren't as scary as they were to me at the start of this conversation. With proactive planning, it feels as though they're going to be pretty manageable as an expense. Cody really got me excited when he said most of his clients he's working with see about a 10% effective tax rate or even lower than that. And let's be honest, if I do end up earning more and paying more in taxes, it's probably a pretty good problem to have. I want to be strategic, but I also don't want to obsess so much that I forget to just go out and enjoy life. All right, so now it's your turn. I want to hear from you. What's your biggest tax concern on your path to FI? And for those that are in early retirement right now, are taxes more or less than what you expected? As someone that's gearing up and getting ready to go into that transition, I would be really excited to talk to you and kind of hear what your personal experience is. You can always send me an email at justin@fiminded.com. That's justin@fiminded.com. Let me know what your thoughts are. I'm happy to dive into more tax-related topics in future episodes. I love learning about this stuff, and both Sean and Cody said that they would come back on and talk any of the other topics that they covered in their book. So if you feel like that would be helpful, send me an email, and I'm happy to plan some more content near the end of the year or early next year around taxes. That's it for now. I'll see you guys next time.